Silence between Sandra and Herbert had started like a crack on glass, barely noticeable at first, but slowly growing with each passing year. In the beginning, they clung to hope like a blanket during Harmattan. Sandra had charted her cycles, learned the medical terms, and swallowed pills that made her dizzy, nauseous, and moody, all in the name of conception. Each hospital visit chipped away a bit of her spirit. First, the awkward ultrasound rooms, then the quiet glances exchanged between doctors and nurses before they'd say, "It may take time." Time. That word haunted her. It became the slow poison in her veins. But now, 5 years later, that silence had become a storm in her chest. Herbert no longer held her after appointments. He no longer asked, "What did the doctor say?" Instead, he buried himself in work, in his phone, in late-night meetings that left her lying awake and alone. The woman who used to laugh at his jokes now barely saw his face. The man who once kissed her temple every night now rolled over without a word. Sandra sat in the bathroom that evening, a familiar ache twisting in her chest as she clutched yet another negative test. Her eyes blurred with unshed tears as she placed the white stick gently on the counter like it might shatter. "Maybe next time," she whispered aloud, her voice hoarse. But she didn't believe it anymore. She walked back into the bedroom where Herbert lay on his side, scrolling through his phone, the blue light casting a cold hue on his face. I took another test today," she said softly, almost ashamed. Herbert didn't look up. "All right," he muttered, more like a reflex than a response. That was it. No follow-up, no shared disappointment. Just, "All right." Sandra nodded slowly, turning off her lamp as tears slid silently down her cheeks. She curled up with her back to him, hugging herself the way he no longer did. The silence wasn't just between them now. It lived with them, and it had grown louder than any scream ever could. It wasn't just the bed that had grown cold, it was everything. The kitchen, once filled with shared laughter over failed recipes, now echoed only the sound of clinking spoons and unspoken resentment. Herbert no longer looked at Sandra the same way. She noticed it most in the mornings, when she stood by the sink rinsing out her tea mug, and he'd walk past her as if she were part of the furniture. There were no stolen kisses or lingering touches. Instead, there were unfinished conversations, half-nods, and sighs that spoke volumes. Sandra tried to reach out, once placing her hand gently on his lap while they watched a late-night news bulletin. He immediately adjusted in his seat and cleared his throat, muttering, "I'm tired, Sandra." That same night, he slept on the couch and didn't offer a reason. But none was needed. The walls between them had been built, brick by silent brick, and now stood tall and unshakable. She didn't know when exactly he stopped coming to the hospital appointments. Only that one morning he looked up from his coffee and said, "I think it's better if you go alone this time." She had smiled weakly, painfully, saying, "All right, I understand," even though she didn't. She sat alone in the clinic waiting room, surrounded by pregnant women and hopeful couples. When her name was called, the nurse asked, "Is your husband not joining today?" Sandra managed a nod. "Work, he's busy." But she felt the sting of embarrassment as she followed the nurse through the doors by herself. That night, when she returned home, Herbert was already asleep, fully dressed, his shoes still on. His phone buzzed beside him, and she saw a notification flash. "Michelle, thank you for today." "I'll never forget it." Sandra's breath caught. She stared at the name for only a second, but it felt like forever. She placed the test results on the nightstand beside him, silently begging him to see it, to ask how it went. But he never did. Sandra first noticed Michelle standing outside Herbert's office one warm Thursday afternoon. She had brought him lunch, an effort to bridge the growing gap, and as she climbed the steps to his floor, she saw the young woman in a tight coral dress leaning against his doorframe, laughing lightly at something he said. Her laughter was carefree, vibrant. It pierced through Sandra in a way no weapon ever could. Herbert looked alive, relaxed. His hand rested near Michelle's elbow as they chatted, and when he saw Sandra, his expression stiffened. "Sandra," he said, taking the lunch bag without meeting her eyes. "You didn't have to come all the way." Michelle turned and smiled, wide, warm, and unbothered. "Oh, you must be the wife. I've heard so much about you." The words were polite, but the tone was laced with something else. Possessiveness? Confidence? Sandra forced a smile. And you are, she asked. Michelle? Herbert's project manager, the woman replied before Herbert could answer, still smiling like she owned the room. That night, the smile haunted Sandra. It wasn't just what Michelle said, it was how she said it. The casual way she touched Herbert's arm, the ease of her posture, the knowing look in her eyes. Sandra replayed the interaction while standing in front of the mirror, her reflection now a stranger. Her skin looked dull. Her eyes, once bright with dreams of motherhood, were hollow. As she sat down to dinner, she tried to speak. That Michelle, she seems friendly. Herbert didn't look up. She's just doing her job. Sandra hesitated. She seems close. He dropped his fork. Sandra, please don't start. I have enough stress at work already. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Sandra lowered her gaze and pushed rice around her plate, appetite gone. She didn't push further. She wouldn't. But deep down, something had shifted. She no longer believed she was imagining things. And Michelle's smile had left its mark. The family compound was crowded that Sunday. Sandra had hoped the gathering would lift her spirits, a momentary distraction from the unraveling of her marriage. But it didn't take long for the weight to settle again. As she helped set plates in the kitchen, she paused when she heard hushed voices behind the pantry door. Maria, her mother-in-law, was whispering with one of Herbert's aunties. I'm telling you, Maria, it's been 5 years. You sure that one isn't barren? The older woman murmured. Maria sighed, her voice tight. Sandra's a nice girl, but maybe not every woman is meant to carry. God knows best. Herbert is still young. He shouldn't waste all his chances. Sandra stood frozen, gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. Their voices faded as they exited the room, unaware she had heard everything. When she emerged minutes later, her face was composed. But inside, something had broken beyond repair. At dinner, Maria smiled at her as if nothing had been said, placing an extra piece of meat on her plate. You're too thin these days. Eat well, my daughter, she cooed. Sandra nodded politely, each chew tasting like ash. Across the table, Herbert laughed at a joke one of his cousins cracked, his arm resting comfortably on the back of Michelle's chair. The entire room seemed to shift. It was subtle but unmistakable. Michelle's presence was being normalized, accepted, and Sandra was becoming invisible, an ornament that had long lost its shine. Later that night, as she sat alone in their room, she replayed Maria's words again and again. Not every woman is meant to carry. It wasn't just a passing comment, it was a verdict. Sandra curled into herself on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The battle she had been fighting wasn't just with nature. It was with the very people who once embraced her as family. The clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender diffusers, but the scent did little to calm Sandra's nerves. She sat stiffly across from Dr. Ocon, her longtime family doctor, who wore a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. Your hormone levels are still unstable, he said, scanning her file. But it's nothing alarming. Likely stress-related. Sandra nodded slowly, even though deep down she was tired of hearing the same thing. I've been on these pills for over a year now, and I feel worse, she murmured. He looked up briefly, then scribbled something on a prescription pad. These are newer supplements. They'll help stabilize things. She took the paper without reading it, her fingers trembling slightly. The pills changed every few months, yet nothing ever improved. Shouldn't Herbert be tested again too? She asked softly. Dr. Ocon chuckled dismissively. No need, my dear. We've already checked him, strong as ever. The finality in his tone left no room for further questions. That evening, Sandra sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the orange bottle in her hand. The label was neat, her name printed clearly across the front, yet it felt foreign. Her body had become a science experiment, poked, prodded, medicated. The moment she swallowed the first pill, nausea followed almost instantly. By nightfall, she was curled on the bathroom floor, her skin clammy and her stomach in knots. Herbert knocked on the door once. You all right? He asked, his voice flat. Just tired, she managed to reply. He didn't press. She flushed the toilet, even though she hadn't used it, trying to hide the sound of her shallow breathing. When she emerged, he was already in bed, the glow of his phone lighting up his face as he typed something quickly, then locked the screen. Doctor gave me new meds, she said. He grunted in response, not looking up. She didn't expect sympathy anymore, but even apathy still hurt. She turned her face to the wall and blinked back the tears. The reassurance she sought had left her feeling more alone than ever. The day began like any other, yet Sandra's heart carried hope. It was their 6th wedding anniversary, and though the past few months had been heavy with silence and distance, she believed, naively, that maybe Herbert would remember. She wore the midnight blue blouse he once said brought out the softness in her eyes, and she baked his favorite vanilla sponge cake, careful to layer it with the buttercream he always loved. By 5 p.m., she had set the table, lit a candle, and turned on soft music in the background. Each passing hour chipped away at her hope. She checked her phone, no calls, no texts. She dialed him once, then again. Both rang unanswered. By 9 p.m., the cake had begun to droop. The candle had burned halfway. The silence in the room was so thick it pressed against her chest. She sat by the window, watching the gate. But he never came. When the sound of Herbert's key finally twisted in the lock, it was past midnight. Sandra rushed to the living room, heart racing. "Happy anniversary," she said softly, her voice trying not to betray the hours she had waited. Herbert blinked, confused. "Anniversary?" he asked. Then realization dawned. "Oh, Sandra, I had a long day. There was a staff dinner and I—" He trailed off, rubbing his neck awkwardly. She gestured toward the untouched table. "I made your cake, just like you like it." He walked past her and dropped his keys on the sideboard. "I'm really tired. Can we talk tomorrow?" Sandra stood frozen as he disappeared into the bedroom, the door clicking shut behind him. Her hands trembled as she extinguished the candle, the scent of burnt wax thick in her nose. Alone at the table, she took a bite of the now dry cake, each chew bitter with disappointment. And in that moment, she realized she was grieving a marriage that hadn't died suddenly, but slowly, quietly, over many forgotten moments like this one. Edwin arrived unannounced the following Saturday. His brows furrowed the moment he saw his sister. "Sandra, what happened to you?" he asked as she opened the gate. She smiled weakly. "I've just been tired. It's nothing." But Edwin wasn't convinced. He scanned her thin frame, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she moved like she was carrying something heavier than her own weight. Inside, he noticed the neglected cake still in the fridge and the silence that hung in the house like a heavy curtain. "Where's Herbert?" he asked. "At work," she replied too quickly. As they sat in the living room, she finally broke. The words spilled slowly about the appointments, the loneliness, the name Michelle. Edwin listened, jaw clenched, trying not to show how furious he was. "This isn't okay, Sandra. You're suffering in silence," he said. She shrugged, her voice low. "What else can I do? I've prayed, I've waited." "You need to get a second opinion," Edwin said firmly. "Let me take you to another specialist. Someone I trust." Sandra hesitated, wringing her hands. "Dr. Okan says it's just stress. And the pills he gave—" "Pills? What pills?" Edwin interrupted sharply. She showed him the orange bottle. He took it, frowning. "Sandra, you shouldn't be on anything that makes you this sick without knowing exactly what it is. Let's do this right. No more guessing." She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe it would lead to answers. But she was so used to disappointment that hope now felt dangerous. Still, she nodded. "Okay, just don't tell Herbert yet." Edwin squeezed her hand. "You have my word." And for the first time in months, Sandra felt a flicker of safety. She didn't know what they'd find, but someone was finally in her corner. The morning sun had barely touched the driveway when Sandra stepped into Herbert's car, looking for her umbrella in the back seat. She didn't expect to find anything unusual, just a quiet search before the rain started. But tucked between the passenger seat and the center console was a small red velvet pouch. Curious, she reached for it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a dainty silver bracelet, delicate and polished, engraved in neat cursive. "To HM, my heartbeat." Sandra sat frozen for a moment, her breath shallow. She turned the bracelet over in her palm like it might change if she looked long enough. But it didn't. The initials were unmistakable. Her chest tightened as a bitter wave washed over her. He never gave her anything engraved, not even in their honeymoon phase. And now, someone else, Michelle, had the words heartbeat inscribed for him. She placed the bracelet back exactly where she found it, not because she didn't care, but because she suddenly did far too much. That night at dinner, Sandra forced herself to chew while Herbert scrolled mindlessly through his phone. She watched him, the way his face lit up briefly at a message, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Did you misplace anything today?" she asked gently. He glanced up, startled. "No." "Why?" Sandra held his gaze for a beat longer than usual. "Nothing. Just thought I saw something in the car." "Pouch." He shrugged quickly. "Oh, that's probably Michelle's. She left some things behind after the staff retreat." Sandra nodded slowly, slicing through her yam. "Of course she seems close." Herbert shifted in his seat, tone turning defensive. "Don't start, Sandra. It's work. You know how demanding our clients are." She didn't argue. There was no use anymore. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above them, thinking not about the betrayal, but the eerie normalcy of it. Michelle wasn't hiding. Herbert wasn't denying. And Sandra, she was beginning to realize that being ignored was worse than being lied to. The company's quarterly event was held at a lush private venue filled with soft lights, music, and business associates mingling over wine and hors d'oeuvres. Sandra arrived quietly, dressed in a simple black sheath dress and low heels, determined to support Herbert despite everything clawing inside her. As she moved through the room, offering small smiles to familiar faces, her ears caught something that made her pause, a laugh. Deep, unguarded, genuine. She hadn't heard that laugh in years. Her eyes instinctively searched for the source, and there he was, Herbert, his arm loosely draped over the back of a chair, head thrown back in amusement. Beside him, Michelle leaned in, giggling softly with her hand resting near his knee. The sight was more than a betrayal, it was a revelation. He wasn't broken by their childlessness. He wasn't mourning their struggle. He had simply moved on. Sandra took a step back, the noise around her fading into a dull hum. She turned quickly, heading toward the open-air terrace to breathe. The cool breeze met her cheeks, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm within. Moments later, a voice called gently, "Sandra." It was a colleague, Edwin's friend, who had always been kind. "You okay?" She forced a smile. "I just needed some air." He nodded knowingly. He shouldn't be flaunting her like that, he murmured. Sandra looked up, startled. "You noticed?" "Everyone noticed," he said softly. "But some things don't need loud announcements. Their body language says it all." Sandra felt the ground shift beneath her feet. It wasn't just in her head. It never had been. Inside, Herbert was still laughing. But outside, under the moonlight, Sandra stood quietly, realizing that the man she once knew had become a stranger before her eyes. The house was still, eerily so, as Sandra tidied up the study that Saturday morning. Herbert had left for a strategy session, and she decided to finally organize the desk drawer he always left cluttered. She wasn't searching for secrets, just trying to feel some semblance of purpose. But beneath a stack of old invoices, she found a white paper bag from a pharmacy. Inside, her fingers brushed against something plastic. A pregnancy test box opened. Her heartbeat thudded as she pulled it out, hands trembling. And then she found the stick, still faintly showing two clear pink lines. Sandra stared at it, numb. It wasn't hers. She hadn't tested in weeks. Alongside it was another slip, a prescription for prenatal vitamins, the patient name at the top, Michelle Agbaj. The air left her lungs. The truth, once a slow drip, had now gushed like a broken pipe. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was fact. He got her pregnant. Herbert returned later that evening to find Sandra sitting in the dimly lit living room. The test and prescription lay quietly on the coffee table. He paused when he saw them, his face paling. "Where did you find those?" he asked. Sandra's voice was calm, too calm. "In your drawer." "Is there something you want to say?" He opened his mouth, then shut it. After a long pause, he muttered, "It just happened." Sandra looked at him, eyes steady. 5 years. 5 years I carried this burden alone. And you gave up on me." Herbert lowered himself into the chair across from her, but she rose before he could speak again. "I don't think I'm the one who needs to explain anything anymore." She walked past him, quiet and poised, the pain in her chest no longer masked by tears. What she had feared had already happened, but the real wound, that he hadn't even tried to hide it, Sandra sat at the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the closed bathroom door where Herbert was showering. The house was silent, except for the sound of running water and her own breath rising and falling in uneven waves. She had rehearsed the words all afternoon. How long? Why her? Why didn't you fight for us? But now, when the moment was near, her voice shrank inside her. What was the point of confronting someone who had already made their choice? She listened to the hum of the water and tried to calm the fire rising in her chest. Herbert emerged minutes later, towel draped over his shoulders, glancing at her as though nothing in their world had changed. "You haven't slept," he remarked mildly. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized how little he carried the weight of what he'd done. "I'm fine," she replied. And just like that, the confrontation she once thought necessary became irrelevant. His silence was answer enough. The following days passed in a haze. Sandra went through her routines like clockwork, but everything felt mechanical. She made breakfast without tasting it, responded to texts with hollow words, and smiled when she needed to, though her face ached with the strain. Herbert, as if sensing her retreat, became more courteous, greeting her in the mornings, asking if she needed anything from the store. But the gestures rang hollow. One evening, he returned home with her favorite fruit juice. "Thought you might want this," he said, placing it on the kitchen counter. She gave a slight nod. "Thanks." There was no warmth in her tone, no gratitude. He hesitated, perhaps waiting for her to say more, but she turned back to the sink. Sandra didn't scream. She didn't argue. She didn't demand explanations. Instead, she withdrew into herself, quietly rearranging her thoughts, her priorities, and, most importantly, her exit. She had loved him fiercely, but she was done chasing a ghost of the man who once loved her back. The living room buzzed with laughter and idle chatter as Herbert hosted a casual dinner for a few close colleagues and family members. Sandra had helped set the table, laid out napkins, and even lit scented candles to cover the dull emptiness she felt inside. But the moment Michelle walked through the door, dressed in a fitted green gown that hugged her curves, her belly still flat, but unmistakably the centerpiece of her smile, Sandra felt invisible. Michelle greeted the guests with ease, giggling as Maria ushered her in like royalty. "Come, come," Maria said with glowing pride. "Sit here beside Herbert. You must be tired, my dear." Sandra, seated at the far end of the room, watched the entire scene unfold like a guest in her own house. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, her answers were brief and composed. The walls she had built within herself were now her only protection. Later that night, as Sandra cleared dishes from the table, Maria approached with a strange softness. "Sandra, you're so strong," she said, drying her hands beside her at the sink. "Not every woman can handle this gracefully." Sandra turned slowly. "Handle what exactly?" Maria blinked. "I only meant Michelle's condition is a blessing. You know how these things work. When one door closes, another womb opens." Sandra snapped, surprising even herself. Maria's smile faltered, then returned with forced politeness. "I didn't mean it that way." Sandra shook her head, finishing the dishes in silence. As the guests left and Michelle air-kissed her goodbye, Sandra offered a faint nod, retreating once again into herself. That night, Herbert lay in bed beside her, scrolling as usual, while Sandra curled up by the edge, watching the shadows dance across the ceiling. This house had become a stage, and she a prop no one remembered to pack away. And yet something was growing inside her, not a child, but a quiet resolve. It was Edwin's call that jolted her from her daze one Thursday afternoon. "I've made the appointment," he said with urgency. "A new clinic, private, highly recommended. Can you come this Saturday?" Sandra's hands tightened around the phone. "I don't know, Edwin. What if it's just more of the same? More pills, more just relax and wait lectures?" His voice was firm. "You trusted the wrong people. Now trust me." The tone of his voice broke through her hesitation. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll come." That Saturday, Edwin arrived early, driving her across the city to a quiet facility tucked behind tall hedges and flowering jacaranda trees. The waiting room was serene. No posters screaming fertility slogans, no couples holding hands with expectant eyes. Just calm, quiet, and a promise of answers. Dr. Nwobi, a tall woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense tone, greeted Sandra with a firm handshake. "I'm here to give you clarity," she said, "not false hope." During the consultation, Dr. Nwobi reviewed Sandra's previous records and frowned. "These prescriptions, they don't align with your reported hormone levels." "Who approved these?" Sandra swallowed. "Dr. Okon. He's been treating me for years." The doctor's brows knitted. "We'll run new tests today. Comprehensive ones. I want to see everything." As blood was drawn and samples collected, Sandra sat quietly, her fingers clenched into fists. Edwin waited for her outside, pacing slightly, worry etched on his face. "How did it go?" he asked as she stepped out. "Different," she said quietly. "And scary." He gave her a one-armed hug. "You're not alone this time." As they drove back home, Sandra stared out the window, unsure of what they would discover, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally searching in the right place. The truth was out there, and this time she wasn't afraid to find it. Sandra sat alone in the examination room, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. The air was cool, sterile, yet heavy with tension as Dr. Nwobi entered, holding a file in her hand. "We need to talk," the doctor began, pulling a chair close. "Your hormone levels aren't just off, they've been intentionally disrupted." Sandra's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Dr. Nwobi placed the file gently on the table. "Traces of certain compounds were found in your system, specifically substances known to suppress ovulation when administered consistently. They don't appear in standard fertility regimens." Sandra stared at her, mouth ajar. "I didn't approve anything like that. I only took what I was prescribed." The doctor nodded solemnly. "Which is precisely the issue. Those prescriptions may have been tampered with or intentionally designed to ensure you wouldn't conceive." The words slammed into Sandra like a brick wall. She felt her body go numb, her breath caught between disbelief and fury. When she returned to the car, Edwin watched her closely. "What did she say?" Sandra leaned against the seat, her voice trembling. "They've been drugging me, Edwin. For years. It wasn't me. It wasn't my body failing me. Someone did this to me." Edwin's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Are you saying Dr. Okon? Or someone behind him?" Sandra whispered. "But it was deliberate." Silence filled the car like fog. Edwin looked at her with quiet rage. "Then we're going to find out who's behind it, I promise." Sandra stared out the window, her reflection blurred by tears. All those nights spent blaming herself. All the shame, the weight, the guilt. None of it had been hers to carry. Now she wasn't just a woman scorned, she was a woman wronged. And the truth was no longer a vague hope. It was a blade, and she intended to use it. 2 days later, Edwin visited the hospital under the pretense of requesting a transfer of Sandra's medical records for her relocation abroad. Dr. Okon's office staff hesitated, but eventually handed over a thick file. He took it directly to Dr. Nwobi, who compared the contents with her clinic's lab results. "These entries are altered," she said without looking up. "See this page? It claims Sandra had low progesterone 3 months ago, but her actual level, tested 2 weeks later at our clinic, was perfectly healthy. The pattern repeats every few months. Someone's been documenting false hormone deficiencies and prescribing suppressants to match." Edwin's jaw tightened. "This is a setup." The doctor nodded gravely. "Not just a medical error, a deliberate manipulation. And it's been sustained over years." Meanwhile, Sandra sat alone in the kitchen, the file open before her. She flipped through it slowly, her eyes landing on unfamiliar medication names, ones she never questioned before. Then, buried deep in the back of the folder, was a note clipped to an old prescription slip. Her eyes scanned the handwriting. "Keep her on this dosage for another 3 months. She mustn't conceive yet. Trust me, we're doing the right thing." Sandra froze. M. There was only one M with that kind of influence in her life. Maria. Her hands trembled as she placed the note down, her stomach churning. The betrayal wasn't just medical. It was personal. The woman who once called her daughter had been silently poisoning her chances at motherhood. Sandra stood up slowly, heart pounding. All these years, she had blamed her body. But it was someone else's hands that had stolen her future. The house was filled with relatives and neighbors, all gathered for what Herbert vaguely described as a special dinner. Sandra had hesitated to attend, but decided against drawing suspicion. She wore a modest dress and tied her hair back, opting for quiet dignity over flamboyance. But when Michelle entered, clad in a silk peach gown, hand resting on her belly, Sandra knew exactly what was coming. The room grew hushed as Maria tapped her glass with a spoon. "Everyone, may I have your attention," she said, her voice bright. "Tonight, we're celebrating a miracle." Michelle stepped forward, her eyes gleaming. "I'm expecting," she announced. "Herbert and I are going to be parents." Cheers erupted, people clapped and congratulated them, and Sandra stood there, still as stone, a smile frozen painfully on her face. She quietly stepped into the hallway, needing air. The walls felt too close, the voices too loud. Edwin followed moments later, his face thunderous. "Are you okay?" he whispered. Sandra nodded slowly. "Yes, because now I know the truth." Edwin looked confused. "The truth?" She turned to him, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "She's not just carrying his child. She's carrying the evidence of their plan." Edwin clenched his jaw. "You want me to confront them now?" Sandra shook her head. "No, let them have their moment. It's easier to destroy something when they think they've won." Her words were sharp but measured. She wasn't broken, she was preparing. Inside, the celebration continued. But outside, Sandra had stepped into a new version of herself, one who had tasted betrayal but wouldn't be swallowed by it. The game had changed, and she had finally picked up the pieces. Edwin wasn't the type to let injustice lie dormant, especially not when it involved his sister's pain. That night, after Michelle's announcement, he returned home and began pulling at the loose threads. He started with Dr. Ocon, searching for financial inconsistencies, and it didn't take long before something caught his attention. Through a contact at the state's medical review board, he discovered a quiet complaint filed 3 years ago, one involving questionable prescriptions and untraceable bonuses. Though the case was buried, the doctor's name appeared in connection to multiple women from one particular region, including Sandra. Edwin's stomach clenched. The next day, he visited the local pharmacy near Maria's neighborhood, posing as a curious relative asking about long-term hormone treatments. The pharmacist, hesitant at first, finally relented when Edwin pretended he was researching a malpractice suit. "Yes," the man whispered. "Someone used to pick up those suppressants on behalf of a Mrs. Maria Olawale. For a patient named Sandra." Edwin's blood ran cold. He sat in his car, knuckles white on the steering wheel, fury simmering beneath his skin. His mind raced with memories of family dinners, of Maria's forced smiles, of the way she'd always emphasized tradition and keeping the bloodline strong. It was never just about Sandra not conceiving. It was about control. Later that evening, he called Sandra. "Are you sitting down?" he asked. When she confirmed, he laid everything out, what he found, who was involved, and the confirmation that Maria had orchestrated it all. There was a long pause on the other end. Then Sandra asked quietly, "Why would she hate me so much?" Edwin's voice was rough. "It wasn't hate, Sandra. It was obsession. She didn't want a daughter-in-law. She wanted a womb she could command." The line went silent for several beats before Sandra whispered, "Then it's time she learns what happens when a womb finds its voice." Maria sat in her sitting room, plucking melon seeds from their shell while humming an old folk tune. She was at peace. Her plans were working exactly as she envisioned. Her son would have a child. Her legacy would continue. Michelle, though modern in appearance, was from her hometown, a girl raised with the right values, obedient and traditional. Sandra, she believed, had served her purpose but had clung on far too long. 5 years of waiting," she muttered, shaking her head. "We cannot waste another generation." Her old friend and nurse confidante, Sister Amaka, soon joined her. The two shared a long history, one that included hushed conversations about guiding fate and protecting lineage. Amaka poured herself a cup of zobo. "You think Sandra suspects?" Maria shrugged. "It no longer matters. Herbert is where he belongs. The rest will fade." What Maria didn't know was that Amaka had been quietly recording some of their conversations, especially after her conscience began to itch with guilt. The suppressed pills, the bribes to Dr. Ocon, and the whispered threats to keep Sandra docile. It was too much to carry. Later that week, Amaka reached out to Edwin anonymously, sending him audio recordings of her and Maria discussing how to make sure Sandra remains childless until Michelle took over. When Edwin received the files, his jaw clenched with each passing second. It was all there, proof, motive, conspiracy. He forwarded them to Sandra immediately. That night, Sandra sat with headphones on, listening to Maria's voice, plotting her downfall with eerie calm. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. When the recording ended, she stood and walked to her mirror, staring at the woman staring back. "You tried to take my womb," she said softly. "But now I carry something you'll never have, Truth." Sandra had never been the type to snoop, but that night something pulled her toward the guest room cabinet, Maria's old drawer where she often stored receipts, medication refills, and family papers during visits. Maria was staying the weekend again, pretending to be helpful with household chores, acting like she was bridging peace between Sandra and Herbert. But while she cooked ogbono soup in the kitchen, humming her favorite hymns, Sandra quietly opened the drawer and began searching. What she found made her blood run cold. Tucked beneath a stack of old church bulletins were 3 neatly folded notes. The first was a letter addressed to Dr. Ocon, thanking him for ensuring Sandra's cycle remained unstable. The second was a detailed medication schedule. But the third was the most damning, it read. "The moment Michelle conceives, reduce the dosage and stop. We'll let nature handle the rest." Sandra's hands trembled as she placed the letters on her lap, her heart beat a deafening drum in her ears. So it was all true. Every suspicion, every sleepless night, every tear shed in the bathroom alone, it hadn't been her body that failed her. It had been sabotage, willful, calculated betrayal. She snapped pictures of the letters and tucked them carefully into a new envelope. Edwin needed to see them. That evening she sat across from Maria at dinner, watching her ladle soup into bowls with a smug smile. Herbert, ever distracted, barely noticed the storm sitting across from him. "You're not eating, Sandra," Maria said sweetly. "I will," Sandra replied, her tone even. But inside, she burned. She was no longer the desperate wife longing for a child. She was a woman armed with truth, and the woman who tried to silence her was now moments away from being exposed. The sky was still dark when Sandra rose quietly from the bed. Herbert snored lightly beside her, oblivious to the suitcase standing by the bedroom door. She had spent the entire night packing with a strange calmness, her movements measured, her mind clear. The letters were tucked securely in her handbag, along with a USB containing the audio recordings Edwin had received. She walked through the house slowly, eyes pausing on framed photographs, wedding portraits, vacation smiles, memories of a woman who once believed love was enough. But not anymore. She placed a sealed envelope on the dining table, addressed to Edwin, and exhaled. Her cab was already waiting outside, the headlights cutting through the early morning mist. As she stepped into the vehicle, the driver gave her a curious glance through the rearview mirror. "Airport, Ma," she nodded. "Yes. And please, drive slow." By the time Herbert stirred awake and noticed the empty side of the bed, the house had already begun to feel too quiet. It wasn't just her absence, it was the emptiness left behind. Her wardrobe stood ajar, half the hangers bare. Her phone lay on the dresser, powered off. On the dining table, he found the envelope. With trembling fingers, he tore it open. Inside were printed copies of her medical test results, the notes from Maria, and a simple handwritten message. "The truth always finds its way. I did too, Sandra." He stumbled into the living room, unsure whether to panic or scream. "Sandra!" he called, as if she might be hiding in another room. But she was gone, and this time she had taken every part of herself with her. In the silence that followed, Herbert realized the damage wasn't just emotional. It was irreversible. The following days unraveled Herbert completely. At first, he tried calling everyone he could, her colleagues, friends, even her distant cousins, but all their answers were the same. "We haven't seen her." Edwin refused to pick up his calls. Michelle, now visibly pregnant, began to sense his spiraling mood and offered little comfort. "You should be focusing on our baby," she snapped one morning as he paced the hallway with bloodshot eyes. "I am," he mumbled, but the truth was glaring, his heart wasn't in it. Not since Sandra left. He visited Sandra's parents in Benin City under the pretense of an apology. but they met him with cold stares and locked doors. He had become the villain in a story that no longer belonged to him. One evening, he drove past Sandra's favorite park, the one they used to walk through on Sunday afternoons. He parked and sat under the jacaranda tree they once called their spot, remembering how she used to laugh at squirrels chasing crumbs. He pulled out the letter again, reading it for the 100th time. The documents spoke louder than any confrontation could. For the first time, he began to truly understand the depth of the betrayal Sandra endured, not from a stranger, but from his own blood. As he sat there, hands buried in his face, the weight of it all came crashing down. Sandra had been right to leave. She had been right to disappear, and he had been wrong, so terribly wrong, not to protect her. Edwin found the envelope Sandra left for him 2 days after her disappearance. It was wedged beneath a potted plant near his front door, protected in a waterproof Ziploc bag. He brought it inside, heart pounding, and opened it with shaking hands. Inside were 2 things, a thumb drive and a note written in Sandra's familiar cursive. For when they come with excuses, use this when silence isn't enough. With a lump in his throat, he plugged the drive into his laptop. The recordings began to play, Maria's voice, calm and calculated, spelling out her intentions clearly. "We need to keep Sandra quiet, doctor. Michelle's womb is the answer now." There were also logs of bank transfers to Dr. Ocon, spreadsheets matching the timeline of Sandra's prescriptions. It was undeniable. It was criminal. He called a lawyer that same night, preparing for a formal case against Dr. Ocon and submitting anonymous tips to the medical council. He also forwarded the audio clips to several trusted media contacts, just in case the system tried to bury it. Later, he sat quietly in his living room, clutching the USB like it was a loaded weapon. "You were never weak, Sandra," he whispered. "You were stronger than all of them." His phone buzzed. It was Herbert. Edwin let it ring. Then again, he finally picked up. "Edwin, I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know any of it." Edwin's voice was ice. "You didn't want to know. There's a difference." Then he hung up. The time for explanations had passed. Sandra had left behind more than proof. She had left behind a storm. And it had only just begun. Sunday afternoon in the Olawale compound was unusually tense. Herbert had called for a family meeting under the guise of reconciliation, but Edwin showed up holding more than bitterness. He carried a manila folder thick with truth. The living room filled slowly with uncles, cousins, and elders, all curious about the gathering. Maria sat in her usual spot near the window, fanning herself gracefully, as if she were above whatever drama might unfold. When Herbert nervously cleared his throat and opened with a few words of apology for the confusion, Edwin interrupted him. "There's no confusion here," he said, his voice steady but cold. "There's only evil, and I intend to name it today." He dropped the folder on the center table with a loud thud, flipping it open for everyone to see. Letters, medical reports, audio transcripts, and proof of payment, all meticulously arranged. "What is this nonsense?" Maria demanded, her voice rising. Edwin looked at her with a fury that had been simmering for weeks. "It's everything you orchestrated to destroy my sister's life. You bribed her doctor, drugged her body, and paved the way for another woman to take her place." Herbert stood still, guilt etched into his face. An elder cousin picked up one of the letters and read it aloud. The room fell into a stunned silence. "You were supposed to protect her," Edwin continued, turning to Herbert now. "But you handed her over to wolves and watched her bleed alone." Maria tried to defend herself. "I did what was best for the family. She couldn't bear children." "She could!" Edwin shouted. "She never had a chance because of you." Maria's hands began to tremble. One of the elders, a retired judge, looked at her in disbelief. "You may have committed a crime," he said quietly. Maria looked away, lips pressed tightly together. The truth was no longer buried, and the ground beneath her throne had cracked wide open. Michelle woke that morning with a strange ache in her lower back and a persistent tightness in her abdomen. At first, she dismissed it as stress. Herbert had grown cold again, barely talking, constantly distracted, phone buzzing with messages he never explained. But by mid-morning, the pain intensified into sharp contractions that sent her doubling over. Panic set in. Herbert rushed her to the hospital, where nurses immediately wheeled her into emergency. The waiting room felt suffocating. Herbert sat with his hands clasped, forehead resting on his thumbs, praying silently. Hours passed before the doctor emerged, face solemn. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "We couldn't save the pregnancy." Michelle's scream pierced the quiet, raw, and primal. Herbert rose slowly, his face blank. He moved toward her room, but when he reached the door, he paused. He didn't know what to say. Inside, Michelle sobbed uncontrollably, curled on the hospital bed, her body shaking. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she gasped. Herbert sat beside her, numb. "I know," he whispered. But even in that moment, he wasn't fully present. His mind drifted to Sandra, to everything he had ignored, to the way her silence had screamed louder than Michelle's tears. Later that evening, when Maria arrived at the hospital and heard the news, she collapsed into a chair, her composure gone. "No, no, no, no," she kept repeating. For her, this wasn't just a personal loss. It was the crumbling of a legacy she had fought too hard to control. "What are we left with now?" she whispered to no one in particular. Herbert didn't answer. He couldn't. He had gambled with love, loyalty, and legacy, and lost all three. As Michelle sobbed beside him, and his mother spiraled in shock, Herbert sat in the sterile white hallway, staring at his hands. They were empty. For the first time in years, Herbert entered Sandra's favorite church, head bowed low, unsure of whether he sought forgiveness or simply escape. He sat at the back pew, watching sunlight pour through stained glass windows that bathed the altar in soft color. "I never knew," he whispered into the silence. "But I never asked, and that's worse." After the miscarriage, he had crumbled. The emptiness at home felt like a punishment. Michelle had moved back to her parents' house temporarily. Maria barely left her room, and Sandra was gone. He tried everything. Calls to old classmates, visits to shelters, even anonymous online searches, all with no trace of her. He posted messages on social media, asking if anyone had seen her. His inbox remained empty. What haunted him most wasn't just that she left, it was that she never once looked back. Desperate, he returned to Edwin's house. The door opened, but Edwin didn't step aside. "I need to find her," Herbert said softly. "You don't get to," Edwin replied. "She's not a lost item. She's a woman who was broken by your silence." "Please," Herbert begged, "tell her I'm sorry." Edwin shook his head. "She doesn't need your apology. She needed your voice when she was voiceless." Herbert's shoulders slumped. Is she okay?" Edwin hesitated, then nodded. "She's healing, and she's far away from here." Herbert looked down at the ground. "Does she hate me?" "No," Edwin said. "She just no longer needs you." With that, he closed the door gently. Herbert stood there for a long time, staring at the closed entrance. For the first time, he understood. Redemption wasn't something you could chase. Sometimes you just had to live with the consequences. Sandra stepped into the small, sunlit clinic for the first time as more than a patient. She was now a quiet presence among women who, like her, had carried invisible wounds. Nestled in a serene town far from the chaos she had escaped, the clinic specialized in women's health and emotional recovery. It didn't boast luxury, but it offered something more precious: peace. Sandra had taken up a part-time role as an assistant coordinator, guiding women through appointments and offering support when they broke down in waiting rooms. She wore no name tag, and few knew her past, but when she looked into the eyes of a woman gripped by uncertainty, she saw reflections of her former self. It was healing, not just for them, but for her. Each soft-spoken conversation, every gentle nod of reassurance, restored parts of her that the past had shattered. During a quiet afternoon, the head nurse approached her with a soft smile. "One of our clients asked if you were a counselor. You calmed her in a way we couldn't." Sandra chuckled lightly. "I'm not a counselor, just someone who understands." That evening, she walked home through a quiet road lined with wildflowers, the same path she had begun taking daily. Her phone remained mostly off, save for the rare message from Edwin. She didn't ask about Herbert. She didn't want to. Closure, she realized, wasn't always about confrontation. It was about reclaiming your breath in places no one tried to suffocate you. In her apartment, a cozy one-bedroom overlooking the hills, she boiled ginger tea and opened a journal she'd begun writing in. Words meant for herself, never for others. "They took so much," she wrote, "but they never truly saw me. That was their loss, not mine. The woman who once begged to be seen had become one who chose herself. And for the first time in years, she felt free. Sandra sat beneath a jacaranda tree outside the clinic, flipping through intake forms when her phone, rarely used, began to vibrate. She stared at the screen. Herbert. Her heart skipped, then steadied. He had found her number. She didn't move to answer. The call rang out once, then again, before falling into silence. A part of her wanted to hear what he would say, to demand why he didn't fight, why he let her bleed alone, why he let his mother crush her spirit. But a stronger part knew no answer could unwrite what had already been done. She placed the phone on the bench beside her and closed her eyes. The wind rustled the trees, soft and soothing. There was no more chaos here, no sharp voices, no betrayals lurking behind kind smiles. Just space, space to breathe, space to heal, space to forget the sound of his name. Inside the clinic later that day, one of the patients approached Sandra tearfully. She had just received difficult results and needed someone to talk to. Sandra listened patiently, holding her hand as the woman sobbed into tissues. "I feel like I've failed," the patient whispered. Sandra squeezed her fingers gently. "You haven't failed. You've endured. That's not weakness. That's strength." The woman stared at her in awe, nodding slowly. After the consultation, Sandra returned to her desk, phone still untouched. The missed call remained. She didn't delete it. She just didn't return it. Some things were better left unsaid, some apologies too late to matter. Herbert had reached for her when she had already let go. And the woman he once dismissed was now a pillar for others, rooted, graceful, and untouchable in her quiet power. Maria sat in her room, hands trembling as she struggled to open the medicine bottle. The diagnosis had come quickly, an aggressive form of kidney failure, worsened by years of ignoring symptoms. The once proud matriarch who orchestrated others' destinies now struggled to climb the stairs without help. Herbert had moved back into the family house to assist her, but their conversations were brief and heavy with the unspoken. She rarely mentioned Sandra, though Herbert often caught her staring out the window, whispering prayers under her breath. One night, he entered her room to find her clinging to a photo from their wedding album. "I wronged her," she murmured. "God knows I did. I wanted control, not pain." Herbert sat beside her, guilt weighing him down. "You didn't just hurt her, Mama. You broke her." With tears clouding her eyes, Maria nodded. "Do you think she'll forgive me?" she asked, voice barely audible. Herbert didn't answer immediately. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I can ask Edwin to deliver a letter." Maria spent the next few hours writing, starting, stopping, crossing out entire paragraphs. The final letter was short, honest. "Sandra, I have no excuses, only regret. If I ever mattered to you, please forgive me, not for me, but so your heart never carries what mine now bears." Edwin received it the next day. He read it once, twice, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. When Sandra called him that evening, he mentioned it. "She's sick," Edwin said. "She wants to make peace." There was silence on the other end. Then Sandra replied softly, "I've made peace, Edwin. But she doesn't need to know that." She didn't ask what the letter said, and Edwin didn't offer. Some closure was meant to stay closed. The bell above the clinic door chimed gently as Herbert stepped inside, removing his cap. His eyes scanned the warm, familiar reception area, neat shelves lined with herbal teas, soft music playing in the background, walls painted in muted earth tones. He looked older than before. His shoulders drooped not from age, but from the weight of mistakes that still clung to him. Sandra stood near the counter, her back to him, organizing a box of medical forms. When she turned and their eyes met, time stilled. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she broke the silence, her voice low but composed. "What are you doing here, Herbert?" He stepped forward slowly. "I had to see you. I needed to say, I'm sorry for not being the man you needed. For not protecting you from the ones who should have protected you most." Sandra studied him carefully. He looked stripped of pride, of ego, of all the things that once clouded his love. But even as she nodded quietly, she didn't smile. "I waited for you to notice," she said. "But you were busy pretending I was the problem. While I was losing pieces of myself, you were letting someone else define what love should look like." Herbert's eyes glistened. "You were never the problem, Sandra. You were the strength I never deserved." She breathed deeply, stepping around the counter to face him fully. "I don't hate you," she said softly, "but you have to carry what you lost. That's your redemption, not my forgiveness." He nodded slowly, shoulders sagging further as if the truth of her words weighed more than he could bear. "Will I ever see you again?" he asked. "Not as the woman you once knew," she replied gently. "She doesn't exist anymore." And with that, she turned away, not in anger, but in peace. The kind of peace that didn't need applause or acknowledgement, only distance. It was early morning when Sandra stepped out onto the quiet hilltop trail, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders and a journal tucked under one arm. The sky was awash with gold and amber hues, the kind that promised new beginnings without announcing them too loudly. She walked until she reached the clearing near the sunflower field, her favorite spot. The breeze was soft against her skin, carrying the scent of earth and hope. She placed a hand gently over her lower abdomen, a small, peaceful smile lifting the corners of her mouth. The swelling wasn't dramatic yet, but it was there, unmistakable, sacred. Her child, her miracle, no doctors, no interventions. Just life, blooming exactly when it was meant to. She knelt by a small patch of wild daisies, whispering a quiet prayer, not for revenge or validation, but gratitude. Back at the clinic, Edwin waited for her return, a cup of warm cocoa sitting on the porch. He had visited often, sometimes staying for weeks to rest from the world they both outgrew. "How's my niece or nephew doing in there?" he teased gently when she appeared. Sandra chuckled, sitting beside him. "Resting, and hopefully nothing like us." They laughed, a soft, shared release of everything that once threatened to bury them. As the sun rose higher, Sandra opened her journal and began to write, not as the broken wife, not as the discarded woman, but as someone who chose herself and finally won. "They tried to take my future, but I reclaimed it. Not through noise, but through becoming everything they said I couldn't be." Nearby, a bird chirped in the still air, and the sun painted her skin in a soft glow. Sandra closed the journal and leaned back against the bench, heart full. This was her dawn, and she would never dim again. Here's the Bible verse, Isaiah 61, verse 7. "Instead of your shame, you will receive a double portion, and instead of disgrace, you will rejoice in your inheritance. And so you will inherit a double portion in your land, and everlasting joy will be yours." This verse speaks to Sandra's quiet suffering being turned into restoration, not just emotionally, but spiritually and generationally. Her endurance was not forgotten. Her silence was not in vain. God replaced her shame with joy. Moral of the story: when the world tries to write your worth in the ink of betrayal, let your healing become the loudest response. Love should never demand silence in the face of injustice. Sandra's journey teaches us that truth doesn't need to shout. It simply needs to be revealed. Real strength isn't in fighting back with bitterness, but in walking away with dignity and choosing to heal in places that do not question your worth. Betrayal may shatter illusions, but it cannot touch destiny. Sometimes, your greatest revenge is to rebuild quietly and become the woman they never imagined you'd be without them. That you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.